In 1847, a doctor in Vienna figured out how to stop women dying in childbirth. The answer was soap and water. He proved it with numbers that were impossible to argue with. The death rate dropped by over 90%. And the medical establishment looked at the evidence, looked at the numbers, looked at the mothers who were no longer dying, and decided he was wrong. They didn't just ignore him. They destroyed him. He died in a psychiatric asylum, committed under false pretenses, still fighting to be heard. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, and his story is one of the most important and most infuriating in the entire history of medicine. But it's also just one chapter in a much longer story, because the thing Semmelweis was trying to tell the world, that soap saves lives, had actually been true for nearly 5,000 years before anyone bothered to listen. This is the history of soap. Not just where it came from, but why it mattered, why it was suppressed, why it was taxed and hoarded and kept from the people who needed it most, and why in the end, a 4,800-year-old recipe turned out to be one of the most powerful tools humanity has ever held. The year is 2800 BC, ancient Babylon. Somewhere in the Euphrates Valley, someone is boiling animal fat with wood ash and noticing something strange. The mixture is transforming. It's becoming something new, something that, when rubbed between the hands, grabs onto grease and dirt and pulls it away. We now call that chemical reaction saponification. The Babylonians didn't have a name for it. They just knew it worked, and they wrote it down. In the 1930s, archaeologists cracked open a clay cylinder sealed for nearly 5,000 years and found the recipe etched into the clay. Fat, ash, water. That's it. That's the formula. And what's remarkable is how unremarkable it looks, because that recipe, with minor refinements, is still essentially what sits on the edge of your bathroom sink right now. But here's the thing that catches most people off guard. The Babylonians weren't using soap to wash their bodies. They were using it in the textile industry to clean wool before dyeing it. Soap was an industrial product before it was a personal one. And it was expensive enough that being clean in ancient Babylon was a visible marker of wealth. Your hygiene told people exactly where you stood in the social order. The ability to wash was a privilege. The Egyptians understood this too, and they pushed it further. A medical document called the Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1500 BC, describes mixing animal and vegetable oils with alkaline salts to produce something remarkably similar to soap, and using it to treat skin diseases. Medicine, not cleaning product, medicine. And their embalmers applied the same logic. They trusted soap-based preservation techniques to protect the bodies of the dead for eternity, not symbolically, literally. And it worked. Some of those mummies are still intact today. The Greeks adapted the formula to their landscape, swapping animal fat for olive oil and producing something gentler, better suited to the Mediterranean climate. The Romans took what the Greeks knew and scaled it into something that looked, for a brief moment in history, like a genuine public health system. Roman bathhouses, the famous thermae, were not luxury retreats for the elite. They were social infrastructure, open to nearly everyone. Hot pools, cold pools, gymnasiums, libraries. You went to the bathhouse the way you'd go somewhere today, where you work, socialize, and catch up on everything you've missed. Soap was central to all of it. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, documented the soap-making practices of the Celtic peoples with something close to admiration, noting their use of a substance they called sapo, made from goat fat and beechwood ash. That word, sapo, is where we get the English word soap. And as Rome expanded, carried soap-making knowledge from Spain to Britain, from North Africa to the edges of the known world. And then Rome fell, and soap fell with it. This is the part of the story that's genuinely hard to comprehend. With the collapse of Roman infrastructure, centuries of accumulated knowledge about public sanitation, hygiene, and soap production simply stopped being practiced across much of Europe. The bathhouses closed, the supply chains collapsed, and for hundreds of years, much of the continent was, to put it plainly, filthy. Not filthy in the way we use that word casually today, filthy in the way that kills people. Because this wasn't just an unpleasant period, it was a deadly one. The Black Death arrived in Europe in the 14th century and ripped through a population that had largely abandoned the sanitary practices the Romans had spent centuries perfecting. Historians still debate the exact numbers, but some estimates suggest that between a third and half of Europe's entire population died in a span of roughly 5 years. And while the plague had multiple causes, the absence of basic hygiene made everything catastrophically worse. What makes this even more striking is what was happening everywhere else at the same time. In Japan, daily bathing had never stopped. It was woven into cultural life in ways that had no equivalent in medieval Europe. In the Islamic world, soap production wasn't just surviving, it was advancing. A Persian chemist named Al-Razi, working in the late 800s AD, conducted rigorous comparative testing and documented that vegetable oil-based soaps were dramatically more effective than those made from animal fat. He published his findings in a work called Kitab al-Asrar, the Book of Secrets. And in the Syrian city of Aleppo, craftsmen developed what is considered the world's first luxury soap, a precise blend of olive oil and laurel berry oil, aged for months until it hardened into a dense, fragrant bar. When European crusaders encountered Aleppo soap in the 11th and 12th centuries, they were so impressed that they established trade routes specifically to import it back home. Soap returned to Western Europe on the back of a holy war. You cannot write history this strange. By the 12th century, soap was back in commercial production across France, Italy, Spain, and England. And almost immediately, organized power found a way to control it. Soap-making guilds emerged across Europe, not casual associations, but rigidly hierarchical organizations with formal apprenticeships, closely guarded recipes, and the legal authority to regulate who could and could not produce soap in a given city. You couldn't just decide to make soap. You had to earn entry into the guild. The guild standardized formulas, marked products with maker's stamps, and created something that functioned remarkably like branding, centuries before the concept existed in any formal sense. But even as soap became more organized and more available, governments stepped in to make it less accessible. For centuries in England, soap was taxed as a luxury item, not lightly taxed, heavily taxed, taxed so aggressively that for working-class families, buying soap was a genuine financial burden. Clean hands were a privilege of the wealthy, written into tax law and enforced accordingly. It wasn't until 1853 that the soap tax in Britain was finally repealed, and for the first time in recorded history, ordinary people could afford to be clean without financial penalty. The year after the tax was lifted, soap consumption in Britain nearly doubled overnight. People hadn't been dirty because they wanted to be. They'd been dirty because the government had made cleanliness expensive. And this is exactly the context you need to understand what happened in Vienna in 1847. Because by then, soap was available. It was cheap. It was everywhere. The problem was that the people who most needed to use it, doctors, had not yet been told why it mattered. And when someone finally told them, they refused to believe it. Ignaz Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician working at the Vienna General Hospital. The hospital had 2 maternity wards. Ward 1 was staffed by doctors and medical students. Ward 2 was staffed by midwives. The mortality rate in Ward 1 was over 13%. Women were dying of puerperal fever, childbed fever, at a rate that horrified even contemporary observers. In Ward 2, the death rate was around 2%. Women knew which ward was which. Some of them begged on admission not to be sent to Ward 1. Some gave birth in the street rather than risk it. And yet the hospital kept operating exactly as it had, because nobody could explain the difference. Semmelweis could. He noticed that the doctors in Ward 1 frequently came directly from performing autopsies on cadavers to delivering babies without washing their hands. The midwives in Ward 2 performed no autopsies. They worked only with living patients. Semmelweis concluded that the doctors were carrying something from the dead into the delivery room. He didn't have the vocabulary of germ theory yet. That wouldn't come for another 2 decades. But he understood the mechanism. He introduced a protocol requiring all doctors and students to wash their hands with a chlorinated lime solution before examining any patient. The death rate in Ward 1 dropped from 13% to 1.3%, almost overnight. More than 90% fewer women dying from a change that cost almost nothing and took less than a minute. You would think that would be the end of the story. You would think the evidence would speak for itself. It didn't. Semmelweis' colleagues rejected his findings almost unanimously. The idea that a physician's hands, the hands of an educated, trained medical professional, could be the agent of a patient's death was considered not just incorrect, but offensive. It implied that doctors were responsible for the deaths they were supposed to be preventing. The medical establishment was not ready to hear that. The prevailing theory of disease was miasma, that illness came from bad air, not from contact. Semmelweis had no framework to offer as a replacement, only numbers, and numbers apparently were not enough. He grew increasingly desperate. He wrote open letters to prominent obstetricians across Europe, denouncing them in terms that became more and more heated. He called them murderers. His behavior deteriorated, and in 1865 he was lured to a mental institution under false pretenses and committed. He died there 14 days later at the age of 47. Some accounts suggest he died of the very same infection he had spent his career trying to prevent, contracted through a wound during a post-mortem examination. The cruelty of that detail is almost too much to process. It would take the work of Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, published in the years that followed, to establish germ theory as scientific consensus and to finally vindicate what Semmelweis had proved with a bottle of chlorinated lime solution and a data set that should have been impossible to ignore. Today, there are statues of him. A major university in Budapest bears his name. He is called the father of hand hygiene, and he never saw any of it. If you've made it this far, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. The hidden thing. The thing that changed everything without ever getting the credit it deserved. Hit subscribe if that's what you're here for, because there's a lot more where this came from. While all of this was unfolding in European hospitals and laboratories, the economics of soap were being quietly transformed by chemistry. In 1791, a French chemist named Nicolas Leblanc patented a process for producing soda ash from common salt, dramatically reducing the cost of one of soap's essential ingredients. The effect was immediate and measurable. Before Leblanc's process, soap was accessible to perhaps 12% of the French population. Within a decade, that figure had risen to close to 80%, and wherever soap access increased, infection rates fell, not as a theory, as a documented, observable fact. By the mid-1800s in America, companies like Procter & Gamble, Colgate, and Lever Brothers had understood something that governments and hospitals had been slow to grasp. Soap wasn't just a product. It was a cultural value waiting to be manufactured. Cleanliness is next to godliness wasn't a proverb by the time these companies were done with it. It was a marketing campaign, printed in newspapers, painted on walls, embedded in the moral vocabulary of the emerging middle class. They didn't just sell soap. They sold the idea that using soap was what decent people did. And it worked. Soap became ordinary, expected, and in becoming ordinary, it did something extraordinary. It reduced the transmission of disease across an entire industrial civilization. Then came the wars. Both World War I and World War II created massive shortages of the animal and vegetable fats that traditional soap required. Chemists in industrial labs were forced to find alternatives, synthesizing new compounds from petroleum derivatives that mimicked soap's cleaning properties without requiring any biological raw materials. They called these synthetic detergents, or surfactants. And here's the irony that ties the whole story together. Most of what you call soap today isn't soap in the technical sense. That bar on your shower ledge, in all likelihood, is a detergent. That liquid pump by your sink, almost certainly a detergent. True soap, made from fat, and lie the way the Babylonians made it 5,000 years ago, is now a specialty product sold at artisan markets and farmers markets at a premium price. The original formula became the alternative. The ancient became the boutique. And then March 2020 arrived. A global pandemic shut the world down in a matter of weeks. Hand sanitizer vanished from shelves within days. People were scared in a way that felt new and ancient at the same time. And in the middle of that, a chemistry professor named Pally Thordarson at the University of New South Wales posted a thread explaining, in plain language, exactly how soap works at the molecular level. It went viral, over 140,000 shares, because it turned out that most people, even educated people, even people who had been washing their hands their entire lives, had no idea what soap was actually doing. Here is what Thordarson explained, and it is genuinely beautiful in its simplicity. A virus, like the one that causes COVID-19, is essentially a ball of genetic material wrapped in a fatty membrane. Soap molecules have two ends. One end is attracted to water. The other end is attracted to fat. When you wash your hands, the soap molecules wedge themselves into that viral membrane and tear it apart. The virus isn't just washed off your skin, it's destroyed, dismantled at the molecular level by the same chemical process a Babylonian craftsman discovered in the Euphrates Valley nearly 5,000 years ago. Hand sanitizer works, but not as well. Soap doesn't just kill. It also lifts and carries away everything, dirt, bacteria, viral particles, and sends it down the drain. A recipe etched into clay before the wheel was in common use turned out to be one of the most effective antiviral tools on the planet. Soap reshaped social hierarchies. It powered the expansion of empires. It created industries worth billions. It survived the fall of Rome and came back stronger for it. It was taxed into inaccessibility, then democratized by a single chemistry patent. It was proved to save lives and then had that proof buried for 20 years by the institution most responsible for saving them. And when the world needed it most, in the strangest and most frightening year most living people had experienced, it was still there. The same basic formula, the same basic job: fat, ash, water, and a molecular mechanism that makes viruses fall apart. The object sitting next to your sink right now has been doing this work for 5,000 years. It didn't need anyone's permission. It didn't need anyone to believe in it. It just needed someone finally to wash their hands. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the subscribe button, drop a like, and leave a comment with whatever everyday object you want us to dig into next. Every room you've ever walked into has a story. Next week, we tell it.